Moving here. We have Phil Wylie up next. Phil is an offensive security expert. A lot of you either recognize the name or recognize Phil, or have probably seen at least a piece of his work at some point in the last decade plus. He's been in this business for well over 25 years, growing up with the business, and is known for his extensive work in both pen testing, offensive sec, as well as education, which is a big part of our community in cybersecurity. He hosts a couple of podcasts and probably has his hand in others, if I had to guess as well, and speaks frequently at these conferences. So if you would, please join me in welcoming Phil.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for joining this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed the lunch and hope you're enjoying the conference. I've been coming here since 2019. It's really amazing to see how it's grown and evolved into this humongous conference that used to be smaller, but really great to see what they're doing. And fortunately, thanks to some sponsors, we got to do some book signings. So if you got around to all the book signings, you got your conference ticket back in books, even if you just got half of the books. So this presentation kind of came from my experience working at a global consumer product company. I was hired in as a red team lead. And the funny thing is I didn't realize just until this year that this is also just kind of a expansion and enhancement of a previous talk. But I worked for this company and they hired me in to be a red team lead. And then, people in the organization didn't know the difference between a security assessment, a pen test, or a red team exercise. And we even had like a director one time wanted a red team operation done against the SAP app. You don't do red teaming against apps. But just seeing that they didn't understand that was the need to educate people in management and people that are working on the defensive side more about offensive security. This is going to help you make better decisions when you're hiring staff or hiring consulting companies, and make sure you're on the same track when you're talking to them. But going back to something that was kind of an epiphany that I just kind of realized this year was the CISO that hired me to run this red team. We're doing a bunch of pen tests, and then I kind of realized recently that, he didn't realize the difference between a red team and a pen test team either. So this was kind of the need for this. And so he kind of mentioned my bio here, but I'm also the author of the Pen Tester Blueprint, which is based on one of my class lectures that turned into a conference talk. So started giving this lecture to my students in January 2018. By November 2018, it turned into a conference talk at our local B-Sides, Dallas-Fort Worth. Gave it at several conferences. I was in the Tribe of Hackers Red Team book, and Wylie Publishing asked me if I had any ideas for books. So I thought this would be a good topic for a book. There was a lot of good content out there learning pen testing, but no one was really telling you the prerequisites, what you needed to learn before starting your learning path and what it entailed becoming a pen tester. So I'm also the hacker of the Phillip Wylie Show, previously hosted the Hacker Factory podcast. And so we're going to cover offensive security and the different types of assessments, identify the gaps in offensive security programs, and strategies for optimizing and overcoming the gaps in offensive security. It's kind of interesting because it's really compliance that really drove the growth and need for pen testing, because a lot of people weren't getting pen tests before PCI required it. And it just kind of seeing how the community's grown, just like in Dallas alone. I would go to conferences or different cybersecurity meetups, and there was only like one, maybe three of us pen testers in the crowd. Now you go to these meetups and there's a lot more. So companies have seen the need, and then compliance has driven it, but also at the same time, compliance has also caused some of these gaps. So introduction to offensive security. So offensive security is assessing a target from a threat actor perspective. So you're using different techniques, including hacking, which is most commonly or most realized by most people, social engineering, and physical attacks, because it's not always the digital landscape where threat actors are gaining a foothold. They are technically, but you can have, say if you per se had a hack-proof environment, which I don't think there's such thing, but if someone's able to get their hands on a keyboard and gain access to a system that someone's already logged into, then it makes the threat actor's job a lot easier. And so this is one of the reasons you need to make sure that you're validating your physical security too. And so offensive security is important and complementary to vulnerability management. So it provides a way to validate the effectiveness of your vulnerability management program. So it's kind of your report card, making sure that you're doing all these things, and as you do it from year to year, it's also grading how well you're remediating those vulnerabilities, removing those threats. So offensive security and vulnerability management. So offensive security is an important complement to vulnerability management, as it provides a way to validate the effectiveness of vulnerability management efforts and ensure that the critical vulnerabilities are being prioritized for remediation. And back to the prioritization, if a vulnerability is exploitable, then it's a higher priority to remediate. Some cases, companies will file risk acceptances, but if it's a vulnerability that can be exploited, you really want to remediate those as soon as possible. One of the lessons that I like to share with people, and I've seen it abused, is risk acceptances. So if you have a vulnerability, risk acceptance is something good to have if you need more time to remediate something. Maybe you don't have the budget yet, maybe it requires more staff, maybe even buying more hardware and software to remediate that item. So the risk acceptances are good to have, but not to abuse. And one of the cases I saw that was a misuse of it, or just not even maybe abusive, but them not really understanding the gravity of the exploit. I was doing a web app pen test for this company, and from the internet, I was able to get command line access to that server through a SQL injection vulnerability. So I was able to get command line access. They had XP command shell enabled, which you don't want open to the internet. And so I was able to get command line access, dump the password hash. In like 30 seconds or less, I was able to crack the password hash with John the Ripper. So I turned in the report. And so far as the rules engagement and scope, it was only for the application. So I really couldn't try to do lateral movement or pivot to other systems or do privilege escalation, because it was only this application in scope. And typically on web app pen tests, you normally don't get command line access or system control like that. So when I turned in the report, they saw that and they said, oh, this is a development environment, we'll file a risk acceptance. The problem with that was, maybe it is a development environment, but it wasn't, I'm pretty sure that it wasn't segmented from the production environment. Plus, someone from the internet can get in internally and gain that system, and I can guarantee you that more than likely that password was being reused in that environment, or easily guessable, because that password was password all lowercase and the number 1. And so you think about password reuse, and you guarantee you another system in that environment was using that password, so it would have been easy for someone to come in and get further access, gain access to data. So kind of your assessment targets, and this is just growing here, you could just say technology and people, because whenever I got started in pen testing back in 2012, most of our pen tests either fell under Wi-Fi pen test, network, or in the network we're including hosts like servers and computers, laptops. And now we've expanded to where now you've got cloud, IoT, different hardware. Senior OT and ICS environments used to be segmented from the IT environment, or well segmented from the internet, but now some of these things aren't. I've worked for companies that had external attack surface management solutions, and there's cases where you see HMI, human interfaces, from ICS environments exposed to the internet. So if anyone gains access to that, they can stop equipment, possibly even cause injury to someone, cause waste of materials because someone got in and was fooling around with the HMI. And so also we're getting to AI. So AI is something that is becoming more readily available. It's been around, but now with the different chat bots out there, you're able to gain access to that. More companies are using that and leveraging AI, so we need to test that. Physical security and people, so these are kind of go hand in hand, because a lot of your breaches are through social engineering. And one of the lessons I want to share here too, if you're doing phishing campaigns through some of the solutions like out there that you can create campaigns, send those out to kind of test security awareness. In my opinion, that's really for security awareness. You want to make sure you're doing phishing campaigns with a payload, because just seeing if people are clicking on links is not enough. You need to really see what happens if someone clicks on a link. A lot of ransomware is spread through phishing emails and malware, so if someone clicks on it, what are they able to do from there? So you want to see what an attacker could do if they get access to the system through someone executing malware. And then back to the people thing, you want to make sure that, back to the physical security, you want to make sure that your data centers are secure, you've got good card access coming in your buildings, setting up traps where people can't just go directly in. If someone comes in, tailgates to stop them, so you want things like that in place, but you also need to test that. And even things like if you've got some kind of, if you're like in the shipping business and you have a fleet of trucks, you don't want people to get access to that. So it's not only the data, it's some of the vehicles and different equipment that your company may have that could be stolen or by threat actors. And so transportation is becoming more popular, and some of you will realize how important that is if you've been to like San Francisco lately and you've seen some of the self-driving cars that are driving themselves. These can be used to weaponize to injure people in the vehicle or injure people on the streets. And another thing that kind of gets looked over in hardware is medical devices. And one of the good things now is FDA, I believe, is requiring pen tests. Before they didn't, and people were able to hack an insulin pump or a pacemaker and actually cause harm to the individual. And you think of, if someone was trying to assassinate someone, it would be a lot easier to do that from a physical attack on a medical device if you know this certain person has a medical device. And with a lot of other technologies, people start out building the technology, not thinking about someone doing harm to someone in that fashion, and also the fact that so many products were built without security in mind. And so it's good that pen testing is becoming part of that conversation, that medical devices are requiring that. And when you get into some of these things, it's just really interesting, even from like a Wi-Fi pen test perspective, when you look at the element that the harm that can be done to people. I've done Wi-Fi pen tests to hospitals before, and I did one time that went into the hospital, was scanning the Wi-Fi network and saw medical devices in the ER and the OR, and really kind of scared me to test that environment because you're worried about if you're doing some scanning, you don't want to take down a device that's keeping someone alive. So different types of security approaches, offensive security approaches. So vulnerability management needs to be included. It's not really assessment type, but it's a very important part of your vulnerability management program and your offensive security program. Also, vulnerability assessments is the next level, penetration testing, and then red teaming, also known as adversary emulation. And we're going to get into the differences between red teaming and pen testing. One of the things too is if you're not working in pen testing, if you're hiring a consulting company or you're working with offensive security people, you need to be able to tell the difference, make sure you're speaking the same language, because some vendors may use that same language, but you want to make sure that it's clear that you're wanting an adversary emulation or a pen test. So vulnerability management is the cyclical practice of identifying, classifying, prioritizing, remediating, and mitigating system and software vulnerabilities or any kind of vulnerability. Vulnerability management is integral to cybersecurity and network security, and must not be confused with a vulnerability assessment. So vulnerability assessments, so this is the next step. Sometimes you see job descriptions for VAPT, that's the VA, the vulnerability assessment pen test, the VAPT, what that stands for. So vulnerability assessments are similar to the vulnerability scanning that you see in vulnerability management, but you're going a step further. You're going in and validating those vulnerabilities to make sure they're not false positives. A lot of times, your vulnerability scanners will find false positives, and sometimes there's mitigating controls in place that could prevent a breach. So maybe it's a vulnerability that was detected that if you don't have mitigating controls in place, it could be exploited. You need to validate that it's a true finding and not a false positive. And also with doing a vulnerability assessment, you're also ruling out false negatives. You're using a different vulnerability scanner to look for vulnerabilities, and I've seen instances where I did pen tests for companies, and I was using Nessus, and the client was using Nexpose, and I found things in their environment their vulnerability scanner wasn't finding, and that's going to be the case too. There may be things that Nexpose may find that Nessus is not currently finding. So running multiple vulnerability scanners, using other tools to look for vulnerabilities, doing manual testing techniques, and so this is basically, and the next step is going to be pen testing, but basically you're looking for all the vulnerabilities, using different testing tools. And sometimes there's cases where it's warranted to do this, because back to the story about the hospital. So when I was doing the pen test for the hospital, discovered all the medical devices on there, they were wanting a pen test. So I went back to the CISO and was kind of showing him my findings and kind of thought, we really need to look at doing a vulnerability assessment instead, but how we're able to still fulfill the same value is do a configuration review of the wireless access points and wireless controllers to see how those are configured. That way, make sure they're configured safely, And that way we're able to do a secure assessment of that environment without putting patients at harm. And so penetration tests, the next level, or pen tests for short. So this is similar to a vulnerability assessment. So you're using this to assess whatever technology you're testing for flaws or whatever scope for the pen test. But you're validating vulnerabilities, you're doing a lot of other steps as mentioned before, but once you find a vulnerability that is exploitable, then you go a step further and you exploit that vulnerability. Once you're exploiting that vulnerability, you see if you can do lateral movement, privilege escalation, see if you can get access to sensitive data. So you're taking that a step further. So this is where, even a vulnerability assessment, you're not really knowing what a threat actor has access to, because sometimes we overlook, or people overlook, especially pen testers that are new. You look at the crown jewels of getting domain admin as your idea of the crown jewels when it's actually the data. Some cases it may just be an open network share in an environment, or a cloud share like an S3 bucket that's open and someone can get access to. And then sometimes another thing to kind of bring up to share a point here too, with the data when you storing these pen tests, I don't want to miss this thought, but I was actually on the ABC News, or WFA in Dallas a couple years ago. Dallas Independent School District had been hacked, and the funny thing about it was one of my friends had conducted pen tests of Dallas Independent School District for 2 years in a row. He came back the second year, they didn't remediate anything, and then he gave them the pen test report, and they wanted the credentials he got acquired during the pen test, anything he cracked or was able to discover through shares, and he kind of warned them and said, you really don't want this information unless you store it securely. So they got the data, they didn't store it securely. A couple students at this high school was going through shares, they found this pen test report. One of the things that was kind of funny about it, they found this pen test report and they were printing out the pages of this pen test report, kind of taunting IT and cybersecurity. And then they were able to gain access because they had the instructions on how the pen test was done, all the steps on how this was done, plus credentials. So they went in to hack the place, had, gained access to all sorts of data, and they sent an email to the principal and some of the school administrators and said, we're just a couple kids, but if you want us to fix this, you can pay us, we can fix these vulnerabilities. And so it was kind of interesting that goes to show a need for remediation, and also too where you store your data. Don't be storing your data somewhere insecurely where people can get access to the pen test report, because that's a map on how someone can hack your environment, plus having the credentials. So pen test types, so these are the different types, and the interesting thing that vary between these types is the amount of reconnaissance that you've got to do. So most common what people hear of is a black box, AKA blind pen test. So this is little to no details on that environment. And so each one of these are going to require more reconnaissance. So out of these methods, the black box or blind pen test is going to require a lot more reconnaissance, because usually you don't have any IP addresses or domain names. You're just out to find information. I had a pen test I did like this once for a chemical company, and we got in there, we had the physical address because we were testing physical security, but went through and tested looking for all the different IP addresses, domains, and did subdomain enumeration. And during the testing, we went ahead and I ran Shodan, and I found that they had a FTP server in Indonesia, and FTP clear text authentication. And the way it found it through OSINT and Shodan is there's the little login banner, the warning anytime you log in your workstation. You see this a lot of times on FTP servers or SSH servers, that little warning banner, and how we found it was the name of that company was in that warning banner. So that's how we found it. So if we hadn't did OSINT, we wouldn't have found that vulnerability. But this took a lot of work to find all the hosts to thoroughly test that environment. But the gray box, this is typically what you're going to mostly see. So a gray box pen test, you're going to have the defined scope. So they're going to give you subnets, domain names. They may not give you each individual IP address. It may be up to you to enumerate the IPs, but then you have a dedicated range of what you're testing. So you actually know what's in scope. You're not going to miss items. Whereas if you look at the first approach, there is a good chance that you can miss things in scope because you're not able to locate those items. And also we get into the white box, also known as crystal box, and now you hear versions of it called assumed breach. And this is detailed information. We've been doing this for years on web app pen tests, because one of the things you want to do is you don't only take just a black box approach to an application. If someone can't hack in and get a foothold and you think it's good, it may not be secure. What happens if you've got someone that's got authorized access? There's a lot of applications out there where you're able to sign up for social media sites, other types of websites you're able to sign up, but what happens, can that user elevate their privileges? Can they gain access to data that they shouldn't? So this needs to be tested. So typically, during this type of a web app pen test, you're using authentication at each level to see what you can gain access to, thoroughly testing the system. And out of these types, the white box or crystal box assumed breach is the more thorough way of testing an environment. Because if you can't get initial foothold, that doesn't mean it's secure. And when you get to the assumed breach, I'm not really sure who to give credit for this, but I first learned about assumed breach pen test through Red Siege. And kind of the thinking is you go into an environment, these EDRs are getting a lot more difficult to bypass. And so what happens if you've got someone that's an authorized user, maybe someone finds credentials on a sticky note in their cube, maybe someone throws out, passwords on a list and someone finds it dumpster diving, or either people find credentials on the dark web. So a lot of the footholds nowadays pen testers are finding is that they're looking at these password dumps and seeing some of these commonly reused passwords, sometimes credentials that someone used to log into a social media site, they may be using the same password internally. And another reason to do this type of testing as well is sometimes nation states implant people within organizations. I heard recently had like KnowBe4 that had someone from North Korea that got hired in their company, and so whenever you work for the company, you've got authorized access to a lot of this stuff, and even if you don't, you're in a position where it makes it easier for them to do a little further hacking and get more access to intellectual property and sensitive data. And so you see a lot of these cases, and then you got disgruntled employees that someone gets upset with the company. Maybe they sell their credentials on the dark web to make money, so we need to consider the insider threat. And also, this also is a good way to test for malware or ransomware, because a lot of cases, the way it's spread is someone sends malware or ransomware to someone, they click on it, and they gain access to the environment. So you want to see what is possible from an authorized user, so you remove some of these threat vectors, then you're going to reduce some of the risks from ransomware and malware. And so Red Team, this is the process of using tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs, to emulate real-world threat actors with goals of training and measuring the effectiveness of the people, process, and technology in defending the environment, also known as adversary emulation. So when it comes to a pen test, unless you're doing social engineering, then you're really not testing the people, you're really purely testing the technology. With a pen test, you're notifying people beforehand, so if there's any kind of issues, IT can fix it. They know whether it's a pen test and not some kind of malicious activity. So that's important. With a red team operation, you have a control group, and usually it's the CISO, maybe some other management, usually outside of security, because sometimes you tell the defenders this is happening, they don't want their team to look bad, so they might tip them off. So you really want this to be like a realistic exercise, like a real breach. And what this also tests is your incident response plan. So not only are you testing the technology, you're testing to see if you're being detected, if the threat is being contained. And one of the best outcomes I've heard of one of these was this company had a IR company on retainer. And so anytime they had an incident, they could bring this company in to investigate it. So during this red team operation, the SOC detected something malicious. They reported it. The incident response team was on site trying to detect and contain and remove the threat. And they notified the CISO, and then the CISO kind of followed back up, so yeah, this is a legitimate activity. But this is the perfect outcome. Maybe they were able to get a foothold, but it was still detected and prevented. So that goes a long way. If you can't prevent it, at least if you're detecting it, then you can do something to stop the attack. And so this is a good outcome and a really good way to test your IR plans. And so here's the slide kind of based on what I mentioned earlier, the inspiration for this presentation. It shows the different type of assessments. So the three to the right are actual assessments, and vulnerability management on the left. It's an important part, so it needs to be included, and you can kind of see the difference. So in all these, you're doing some type of discovery. Asset discovery on your vulnerability management. Once you get into vulnerability assessments and penetration testing and red teaming, this is actual reconnaissance. And one of the important things about vulnerability discovery, the asset inventory, is having an accurate list of assets to test. If you don't know about certain items, it's hard to defend or assess those. So making sure you're having a good asset inventory, a lot of times that's missed out on. And so you do the vulnerability scanning and then the validation. And also through this process, patching is part of that patching or remediation is part of that vulnerability management program. So you want to make sure that you're patching, and after you've been patched, doing a vulnerability scan to make sure that those CVEs have been removed is good. And so with the vulnerability assessment, as we mentioned earlier, you're doing the reconnaissance, discovering the assets that are in scope, doing vulnerability scanning, manual testing, and vulnerability validation, and the penetration test. You're going a step further. You're doing actually exploitation and post-exploitation. So when you get into the red teaming or adversary emulation, you're still doing reconnaissance, but one of the things you have to do here is you're having to be quiet with the type of reconnaissance you're doing. You don't want to be detected. And it's interesting what you can get by with sometimes and not get detected, because I've seen organizations like that one black box pen test I was talking about earlier. We got down to the last day and we were testing physical security. So we were in a small office within that building and we had such limited time, so I had to go doing Nessus scans, running responders, seeing if I can capture any hashes. And we were running all this really loud in the environment. I exploited an XP system, and this is 2018. Some people take pen testing courses or C courses, and they see older operating systems. They think that doesn't happen in the real world. It still does. You see a lot of OT and ICS environments that still have like XP and Windows 2000. So we were so noisy in there, then I was able to exploit that system, gain access. They didn't detect us until about 12 hours later. And so they had a very skilled CISO, and his team were constantly getting training, but they just really didn't have those endpoints detected, and they totally missed all that traffic. So back to the red teaming, so you're doing things that normally you're trying to go undetected. And sometimes these engagements can take weeks or months or even spend a whole year on it. So you're emulating a threat actor, you're emulating something that would lead to a breach. So the main two differences, so you really want to not get into the red teaming or adversary emulation until your environment's mature, after you've been through some pen tests, remediation, have an ongoing vulnerability management program. That way you kind of remove the really easy ends, because pen testing, you find all the exploitable vulnerabilities. With a red team operation, you're only finding one or two ways in, and that's it. So you could miss a lot of vulnerabilities. So you can't rely on red teaming to make sure that you're secure. It's kind of seeing what happens in a breach, testing your incident response plan. It's kind of an important part, but really these other sub-assessment types you really want to focus on. So identifying the gaps, so kind of a little history on offensive security. So pen tests were less restrictive at one time. There were more full scope pen tests. Things like social engineering, physical testing were in scope. And what happened, PCI and other compliance requirements come along and drove the need for pen testing. Companies had limited budgets, so they weren't really able to have all this other extensive testing done and focusing on a small part of the environment. So a lot of companies, when you're doing PCI pen test, you're focusing on the card data environment, and there's other areas that sensitive data's in, and threat actors could get into the environment. That's not the only important area, so they kind of got overlooked. So this kind of led to some of the gaps. So some of the gaps were different types of pen testing not being included, like social engineering, physical pen testing, and so this is where this kind of got missed out. And so other limitations is the frequency. So pen tests are a snapshot in time of your pen test, sometimes referred to as a time box test. So it's only what that system is like or that environment at that time. You can update patches the next day, add new software to the environment, hire new people. Your threat landscape has changed because of that. So time between tests are opportunities for threat actors. And another kind of use case for doing frequent pen test, one of the companies I consulted for, we did a pen test of a company. It was an external pen test, and they had signed up for a 90-day retest to make sure that they remediate everything. Some companies don't do the retest, but what happened to that time, we came back, I was doing my vulnerability scans. They had remediated all the highs, mediums, criticals. There were just a few lows left. But within that 90 days, an exploit came out for one of those low criticality vulnerabilities, and so it was exploitable. If they hadn't had that retest done, it would have been open for another year. There would have been a year's worth of opportunity for someone to exploit that system. So time between tests is very important. You see a lot of companies do it once or twice a year, but you really need to be doing that more frequently. So methods overlooked physical security controls through testing buildings. Social engineering, red teaming, sometimes this is missed out. Assumed breach assessments, kind of back to that, the white box type testing. Sometimes this is left out because what's routinely happened and still happens today is someone brings in a pen test team, they're not able to get the initial foothold, they send back a report that looks really good, but they don't know what would happen if someone had access to that system. And then purple teaming, also kind of referred to as security controls validation. This is a really good way to mature your environment because what you're doing here is you've got so many cycles of pen testing, doing the remediation, doing your vulnerability management, your patching, but that takes a while to mature. But if you do purple teaming, you're actually testing different specific attacks against your endpoints, seeing if it's detected, and you're able to remove tools like Mimikatz and different types of attacks that if you remove that out of the hands of threat actors, you're reducing the tool set that a threat actor has. You may not prevent like a nation state, but like script kiddies are a little less experienced, you're able to remove that. So that's really a good way to test those security controls and improve your environment. And it's also a good way to instill a culture of collaboration between the offensive team and the defensive and offensive teams to help them build that collaboration. Because for a long time it's been us against them. One of the offensive security teams trying to beat them. And so if you build that kind of camaraderie, collaboration, and teamwork together, it's going to go a long way. And that way the defensive team also understands pen testing better and offensive security, how that works, and then kind of get to see that that's actually a way to help them improve the security posture and gain more acceptance among those teams. And so also limitations of overlooked environments. So wireless networks sometimes may get overlooked, cloud. And then also one of the things with cloud is some people think that you move to cloud that automatically we're more secure. That's what a lot of people got sold on and why they migrated to the cloud. But you also need to make sure you're testing things like wireless networks and cloud. Also like your IoT devices, your IP cameras. A lot of times they have default credentials. Someone's able to gain access and view sensitive environments within an organization. Sometimes that's how, if the cameras are wirelessly connected, sometimes that's a way for someone to get in the network. Wireless cameras and IoT devices, sometimes they're not secure, and that's a way for someone to gain access into that internal environment along with like wireless networks. So strategies for overcoming gaps in offensive security. So with the frequency, so increase pen test frequency, implement automation to improve scalability and frequency, and also like autonomous pen testing is very helpful there. You're able to do so much more with like autonomous pen testing, whereas companies are doing one pen test a year, sometimes some they're doing 30 or 40 pen tests a year. You're able to do that more frequently, and as I mentioned before, that threat landscape is constantly changing. We have a client that actually had told us that that we have a patch Tuesday, so they should be a pen test Wednesday to go in and test those patches to make sure that they're remediating the vulnerabilities as well as not opening up new vulnerabilities. So also implementing bug bounty and responsible disclosure programs. So this is one way with the autonomous pen testing and that frequent pen testing along with bug bounty. This is a way to constantly be monitoring your environment. The one thing I say about bug bounties is if you know the difference between bug bounties and pen tests. Pen tests, you're paid regardless if you find anything or not. Bug bounties, you only get paid if you find things. So you get a lot better at it. So one of the things I like to describe is if you're a fisherman for sport compared to someone that fishes for food, the person that fishes for food is probably gonna be a lot better because if they don't catch the fish, they don't eat. With the person doing it for sport, it's not a big deal. The same thing with finding bugs. They're forced to be more creative. In pen tests, sometimes it's the time limitations. You're not able to get in. And that's kind of one of the reasons I found out about bug bounty. I started following Jason Haddock's years ago, and I learned a lot of these techniques and tricks that bug bounty folks were doing. So having a bug bounty program or responsible disclosure, because there's cases where you may have someone using your website that understands security. They may see something that's insecure and report it. And one of the things I say, if you run these type of programs, kind of be respectful of the security researchers, because there's some cases where companies don't want to pay them, don't want to work with them, try to ignore it. So take it seriously, because this is a good way to have unlimited resources testing your external attack surface. And also overlook methods. So implement the following methods like social engineering, including real phishing campaigns, not just a click on this, those, and I'm not saying not to use those programs, because those other platforms are good, because you can actually plug in JavaScripts within those to test payloads. So you really want to make sure you're testing payloads to see what happens if someone clicks on something. Physical security control assessments, this is really important to do. Red team operations, like I said, this is not as much of a priority, but a lot of times it gets overlooked. And one thing with red team operations, this can also include physical security. There's a lot of people that work on the red team side that specialize in physical security and social engineering. And then purple team, also known as security controls. So you can do that with breach and attack simulation products, and like atomic red team scripts. When I worked at the large global consumer products company, we would run the atomic red team scripts in the environment doing purple team exercises to be able to find those different types of risks and remediate those, seeing if things were being detected or blocked. And another thing you do with these too, that some of them are kind of safe. For instance, they have like a version of Mimikatz that basically has all the signature to see if it's being detected, but doesn't have a payload, so it's not causing any kind of harm in your environment. And so overlooked environments, so wireless networks, cloud, IoT environments. And so that concludes the presentation. We can open it up for Q&A, and if you have any questions after this, I'll be over in the Village at the Horizon 3 booth, so you can come check us out and find out more about autonomous pen testing and how you can automate and scale your pen testing efforts. And here's my contact information. Feel free to connect with me. If you can't think of questions today, feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to answer questions, have a Zoom call or whatever, just to discuss cybersecurity and career stuff.
Got a question over there to your right, Phil.
Okay. I think they're going to try to bring you a mic over there.
So what do you typically do once on a red team engagement, they are discovered and this is getting escalated where you need to basically call a pause and tell the SOC, this is a test. What do you typically recommend people do? Transition to like a blind approach, you continue to test but don't tell them what you're doing and they kind of know you're there? Or do you just switch to purple team? Let's say you have an engagement, it's a fixed fee engagement for 8 weeks and they're caught in week 4 because of whatever.
Yeah, in that case, I would say it'd be a good opportunity either, like you said, switch to purple team engagement, or take what they found there and just kind of almost continue as a pen test. What are we able to do with that and monitor? So at least that way, that is a good outcome for the people requesting that service. It was detected, but let them go ahead and finish the test. And this is sometimes I've seen people doing pen tests where they're trying to go undetected, and at that point, you need to just go ahead and finish the test because you don't want to lose out on, those hours that you have left and use the most of it. And that would be a good opportunity, like you mentioned, the purple team engagements. Maybe this would be something if you could get the consulting company to let some of your teammates kind of shadow them and kind of learn from it. But purple team exercise would be a good pivot from that, or just kind of finish up with what they have, kind of finish as a pen test as it's known going on to finish it, because there could be things that they find there. So at least it's kind of a good report card. You found it and could contain it, but go ahead and let them finish so that way they can find any kind of vulnerabilities so you get the most bang for your buck out of that. So great question.
One more. You don't get to talk to Phil a whole lot, so do we have one up front?
My buddy Jim's got a question.
So, with everybody working remotely, if people are hooking up their work computer to their home network, how does that impact the scope of doing a pen test or the vulnerability exposure of that machine?
Yeah, so kind of what you have to do there. So his question was, what with everyone working remotely, how do you deal with work from home folks? So one of the things you kind of need there is you need to make sure that you have like a laptop that's being used and perform a pen test against that to see what vulnerabilities you have there. But then you're kind of running into the limitations of what kind of Wi-Fi routers and stuff are they using at home. But then that's going to be down to make sure that your VPN solution and your remote access solutions are solid. A great question. That makes it kind of tough. I've seen organizations where they actually did any work, they take a gold image of whatever laptop and they perform a pen test against that. And even some of the branches, we would do pen tests against like some of the Wi-Fi routers and their Wi-Fi configurations to see how secure that was before it even shipped out to the location.
Yeah, I know some companies will ship a router to
Yes.
the person with the computer, and that computer can only be put behind that router.
Yeah, one of the best setups I've seen when I worked for the consumer products company, actually with the executives, they actually performed a pen test at their home, did a security assessment. So they went on site in their home environment, performed a pen test, just looking at any kind of physical controls and just looking at their setup because they actually provided like a remote, I forget what the device was, but it was like a remote access device that was required to gain access to their network, but they actually went and did like a assessment against that to make sure they were secure. Great question. Yes?
It's more of a tooling question, but you mentioned asset databases and vulnerability scanners. Are there any kind of gold standard for those that you've seen?
All of them work pretty well because I see a lot of people with vulnerability scanners are using Qualys, Tenable, so Nessus is more their standalone portable version. That's what I've seen most of the time as a pen tester. Nessus was my preferred vulnerability scanner, but Nexpose is pretty good. That's pretty common. OpenVAS by Greenbone, they've got a free version and a commercial version. So those are pretty normal there. And as far as other tooling goes, a lot of the open source tools that you see on Kali Linux, because there's some really good projects out there that people are using, just like PowerShell Empire for like a C2. There's a lot of good projects out there. So just most of the things you see on Kali Linux, the nice thing about the pen testing tools is you can get a lot of stuff for free. And I've had access to the professional version of Metasploit as well as Metasploit framework. And really the only benefit you're getting from that is if you have Nexpose for your scanner, you're able to easily move from Nexpose to Metasploit and run it that way. And it's interesting, most of the organizations I work for as a consultant, we never had Metasploit professional, even though we were making money off pen tests, but you saw enterprises where people would have it. So, but yeah, so a lot of the open source stuff is good, and I really haven't heard any complaints about Qualys, Nexpose, or Tenable, any of their products. Great question. But it gets a little more difficult when you get into wireless stuff, because most of the Wi-Fi testing stuff is mainly open source, although there's a couple of commercial tools. There's one called Selenium. I think the company was owned by the company that started Core Impact. They got one called Selenium that's really nice, that it's like one application that you run your scans through. It does like attacks and password hacks. With wireless pen testing, there's so much manual that you have to be pretty skilled to be able to do those Wi-Fi pen tests. Of course, you got things like Wi-Fi pineapples that can help automate and make that process a little bit easier. Yeah.
Phil, you had talked earlier about PCI compliance. Under the 4.0 framework, there is now a requirement to have authenticated scans, vulnerability scans.
That's great to
Do
hear.
you see that happening more with the pen testing? Because that's not always a requirement for them to be able to do that.
That's a good question. So I'm starting to see that a lot more. Companies are starting to do that because really, honestly, if you don't do an assumed breach method, you're really wasting your money on pen tests. But there's some people that don't really understand and fully embrace. They're just wanting the check mark. But really, to do it the right way, you really should be doing assumed breach. But I would say start off and see if you can get a foothold first, and then go to assumed breach. That way you're testing. Because I see people having assessments where they will just have someone, okay, you start on this. Could be a jump box that's attached to a PCI environment or something in a DMZ. Where can you get from there? I've seen that kind of instances, but I definitely think assumed breach. That way you're more thoroughly testing it, even back to applications. Doing that authenticated testing is a better way to thoroughly test that system. Great question. And thanks for that comment. I didn't realize that PCI was requiring that. I think they started requiring more than one pen test a year, if I'm correct. Do you know? Quarterly.
Exposed interfaces.
Okay.
And one time a year they want ongoing.
Okay, that's good to hear. Anyone else?
All right. Thank you, Phil, very much.
Thank you.